If you've spent the last hour scrolling through a streaming app thinking you've seen everything worth watching, you haven't. Honestly, most horror that gets pushed to the front page these days is just loud, expensive noise designed for people who think a jump scare is the same thing as being scared. It's not. I've spent an embarrassing amount of my life digging through the corners of the internet to find the films that actually stick with you, the ones that properly haunt you for days. These are the 10 most underrated horror films you've probably never heard of, and I promise you, at least 3 of these are going to end up on your watch list before this video is done. If you really love movies like me, hit subscribe. Kicking off our list at number 10 is a film that every hardcore horror enthusiast worships, but the general public somehow completely missed. Lake Mungo is an Australian mockumentary about the death of a 16-year-old girl, Alice Palmer, and the haunting that follows her family in the wake of her drowning. I am categorizing this as mainstream underseen, because while it has a cult following, it deserves to be a household name. The film uses interviews and grainy home video footage to build a mounting sense of dread that feels properly real. What makes this film genuinely brilliant is how it uses the documentary format to explore the unsettling horror of sorrow and the secrets we keep from those we love. There is a specific image toward the end, a video found on a cell phone buried at the lake. That is one of the most disturbing things I have ever seen. I honestly had to pause the video because the combination of the low-resolution footage and the sheer inevitable realization of what Alice was seeing was too much to process. Director Joel Anderson creates this clinical, detached tone through the interviews, which only makes the supernatural moments feel more like a cold, hard fact of life rather than a movie trope. It is a film that understands that the most terrifying thing about a ghost isn't that it's there, but why it came back in the first place. This is the most heartbreaking film on this list. At number 9 is a film that a major studio literally tried to bury, and that is a genuine injustice. The Empty Man was a victim of a massive corporate merger and was essentially dumped into theaters with zero marketing, causing people to assume it was just another generic teen slasher. They were dead wrong. The first 22 minutes of this movie are a standalone masterclass in cosmic horror, set high in the mountains of Bhutan. It follows 4 hikers who find an ancient, inhuman skeleton embedded in a cave wall. And the way director David Pryor builds the atmosphere in that prologue is just spectacular. The sound design is what really gets to me. The specific, high-pitched whistling of an empty bottle and the way the wind seems to carry voices that shouldn't be there. Once the film shifts to modern-day Missouri, it becomes this sprawling 2-hour detective mystery that delves into tulpas and the terrifying idea of thought forms becoming reality. The transition from the isolated, snow-covered mountains to the grimy, cult-infested city streets is handled with such a confident sense of dread. It is an ambitious, weird, and properly singular vision that asks you to pay attention to every shadow in the corner of the frame. If you haven't seen the opening prologue of this film, you haven't seen the best horror filmmaking of this decade. Number 8 belongs to a tiny Irish indie that proves you don't need a massive budget to create absolute nightmares. Caveat follows a man with partial memory loss who is hired to look after a woman in a decaying house on a remote island, with the caveat that he must wear a leather harness and a heavy chain that limits his movement to specific rooms. This setup is a genius piece of claustrophobic design, but the thing you'll actually remember is the drumming rabbit toy. This decrepit mechanical doll has human-looking eyes, and it starts drumming whenever it detects something or someone moving in the house. The way director Damian McCarthy uses that toy to build tension is one of the most effective things I have seen in years. There is a specific scene where the protagonist is crawling through a narrow space inside the walls and the rabbit starts drumming behind him, and I was literally leaning away from the screen in my own house. The film doesn't rely on music to tell you when to be scared. It uses the silence of that rotting house and the mechanical thud of those drumsticks to slowly shred your nerves. It is a quiet, grimy, and properly unsettling piece of filmmaking that rewards multiple viewings. 40 years from now, it will still work. At number 7 is a film that uses horror to talk about something much more real and much more terrifying: the slow decay of the human mind. Relic follows 3 generations of women as the family matriarch, Edna, begins to succumb to dementia, and the family house literally starts to manifest her mental decline. Director Natalie Erica James uses the architecture of the house as a physical metaphor, making the walls grow black mold and the hallways turn into a shifting, labyrinthine maze. It is a gut punch of a movie that captures the horror of caretaking with brutal honesty. There is a specific sequence where the daughter, Kay, gets trapped inside a narrowing, mold-covered corridor that is genuinely one of the most claustrophobic things I have ever watched. The physical transformation of Edna in the final act, where the mold takes over her entire body, is handled with a level of practical effects mastery that is both disgusting and deeply moving. Most horror movies try to make you jump, but Relic wants to make you feel the unbearable weight of watching someone you love disappear while they are still standing right in front of you. We're at number 6, and I need to talk about Rebecca Hall. In Resurrection, she plays Margaret, a hyper-competent woman whose life is derailed when a man from her past, played by Tim Roth, suddenly reappears. This man, David, claims something happened 22 years ago that is physically impossible and utterly horrifying, and he begins a campaign of psychological gaslighting that is properly chilling. There is a 7-minute sequence in the middle of this film where the camera just stays on Rebecca Hall's face in a single close-up as she delivers a monologue about her trauma. It is one of the greatest acting feats in modern cinema history. I honestly could not look away as she unraveled this bizarre, sick story about a baby and an oven that sounds like a nightmare but is delivered with the conviction of a memory. Tim Roth is equally terrifying because he never raises his voice. He just smiles and tells Margaret that he's doing her kindnesses while he methodically destroys her life. The film builds this unbearable sense of pressure until a final act that goes in a direction I promise you will never see coming. It is bold, it is weird, and it is genuinely unlike anything else on this list. All right, we are completely changing direction at number 5 with a film that I will go to my grave arguing is the best detective thriller ever made. Kiyoshi Kurosawa's Cure follows a weary police detective investigating a series of bizarre murders where each victim has an X carved into their neck. But the killers are always different people who have no memory of the crime. This is J-horror, but it's not the kind with ghosts in wells or long-haired girls in mirrors. It's a film about mesmerism and the terrifying idea that your own mind can be hacked by a stranger. For years, this movie was a hidden gem buried in the Criterion Collection that only hardcore cinephiles talked about. But it's recently found a second life on Letterboxd where people are finally recognizing it as a masterpiece of tone. If you like the cold, procedural dread of David Fincher's Seven, this is the supernatural cousin you've been looking for. What makes Cure genuinely brilliant is the sound design and the use of mundane spaces. There is a specific scene where the antagonist is just flicking a lighter in a dark room, and the repetitive click of the flint combined with the way he speaks in these circular, hypnotic sentences is properly unsettling. It makes you feel like you're being hypnotized along with the characters on screen. It is a film that doesn't rely on jump scares because it's too busy trying to convince you that your own free will is an illusion. I honestly had to sit in the dark for 20 minutes after it ended just to feel like myself again. It is a quiet, intellectual nightmare. Number 4 is a film that horror fans absolutely adore, but the mainstream audience largely ignored when it dropped in 2020. The Night House stars Rebecca Hall as Beth, a woman unraveling after her husband's sudden and devastating decision to end his life, alone in the lakeside house he built for them both. As she begins to uncover the secret life he was leading, she finds blueprints for a mirrored, reverse version of their home. This film was a Sundance darling that got caught in the tail end of the pandemic theatrical slump, which is a tragedy because it is one of the most visually inventive horror films of the last decade. On Reddit horror communities, this movie is constantly cited for its nothing scares. The way director David Bruckner uses the negative space in the architecture to create silhouettes of a man that only appear when the camera is at a specific angle. There is a specific moment where the molding of a doorway and the shadow on the wall perfectly form the outline of a person standing right next to Beth, and then she moves and the person vanishes back into the house. It is brilliant filmmaking that rewards you for scanning every inch of the screen with absolute terror. Rebecca Hall is, once again, the anchor here. Her performance of raw, angry grief is so believable that it makes the supernatural elements feel earned. It's a film about the ghosts we make for ourselves when we can't let go. It deserves your full attention. At number 3 is a film that is so visceral and blood-soaked that it actually feels like it's attacking your retinas. Possessor, directed by Brandon Cronenberg, follows Tasia Voss, an assassin who uses brain implant technology to inhabit the bodies of other people to carry out high-profile hits. Brandon is clearly walking in the footsteps of his father, David Cronenberg, but he has a visual style that is entirely his own. The story of this film's discovery is basically a word-of-mouth explosion among fans of extreme cinema who were looking for something that didn't rely on CGI. The practical effects here are properly disturbing, specifically the melting transition sequences where we see Tasia's identity literally dissolving into the person she's inhabiting. There is a specific scene involving a surgical mask and a fireplace poker that is so brutal it caused walkouts during its festival run, but it's not just gore for the sake of it. It's a movie about the loss of self and the terrifying idea that you can spend so much time being someone else that there's nothing left of the original you. Andrea Riseborough plays Tasia with this hollow, haunted intensity that makes you feel the weight of every life she's stolen. It is a visual feast of trauma that will stay with you long after the final frame. This is high art body horror. We're at number 2, and honestly, I'm still a bit shaken by this one. Despite the recent high-profile remake, the original 2022 Danish version of Speak No Evil remains the gold standard for social horror. The premise is agonizingly simple. A Danish family meets a Dutch family on vacation and accepts an invitation to visit them at their rural home a few months later. What follows is a slow, agonizing breakdown of social boundaries. This film became a viral sensation on Letterboxd because of its mean-spiritedness, but I genuinely believe that's a misunderstanding of what the movie is doing. It's a horror of politeness. It's about the terrifying things we allow to happen to us simply because we're too afraid to be rude or awkward. There's a specific scene at a dinner table where the hosts repeatedly ignore the Danish mother's request regarding her daughter's food. And the way the tension builds in that silent, polite space is more stressful than any slasher chase. You are literally screaming at the screen for them to just leave, but they stay because they don't want to cause a scene. The final 30 minutes are some of the most devastating and uncompromising minutes of cinema I have ever witnessed. It is a film that looks you in the eye and asks you exactly how much of your soul you'd give up just to avoid an uncomfortable conversation. I've seen it once. I don't think I can ever watch it again. That is a proper accomplishment. And finally, at number 1, the film that genuinely feels like the new king of possession horror, When Evil Lurks is an Argentinian masterpiece directed by Demian Rugna, and it is the most uncompromising, brutal, and properly terrifying film I have seen in years. It follows 2 brothers in a remote rural town who discover a rotten, a man possessed by a demon who is physically decaying while still alive. This isn't your typical Hollywood possession movie with priests and crosses. This is something much darker and more visceral. The film has its own 7 rules for dealing with the possessed. Things like never use electric lights or never use a firearm. And the way the characters are forced to navigate these rules while the world literally falls apart around them is spectacular. It found its audience through massive word of mouth on Shudder and Reddit, where it's been described as a film that hates its audience because it refuses to give you a single moment of safety. There is a specific scene involving a family dog that is so shocking and so perfectly executed that it caused a total meltdown in the horror community when it first dropped. I honestly had to stop the film and walk around my house for a minute just to process the sheer hopelessness of the situation. It breaks every single taboo of the genre with total conviction. If you like the chaotic energy of the original Evil Dead but wanted it to be 100 times bleaker and more grounded, this is the film you've been looking for. It is a masterpiece of modern dread that treats its audience with zero mercy. It's the best horror film you haven't seen. End of story. And that is the top 10. 10 films that prove the best horror isn't always the stuff with the biggest marketing budget. It's the stuff that's being made in the corners by directors who are willing to take risks and tell stories that actually stick in your throat. From the quiet documentary-style grief of Lake Mungo to the absolute uncompromising nightmare of when evil lurks. These are the movies that remind me why I genuinely love this genre. Horror is at its best when it's pushing boundaries and making you look at things you'd rather ignore. Whether it's the social horror of Speak No Evil or the psychological pressure of Resurrection, the range of what these filmmakers are doing is properly inspiring. Which film on this list genuinely surprised you? Drop it in the comments. If this list sent you to your watch list, a quick thumbs up goes a long way. The algorithm actually responds to it, and it helps this channel reach the people who need it. And if you really love movies like me, hit subscribe. The videos only get better.